Welcome to the Right Side Up podcast with your hosts Danielle Strickland and James Scholl. This season is Need to Know, everything we want to tell Christian leaders about the future of the church and how empowering women is mission critical to a flourishing future. The book Need to Know will be available October 11th, but to get us started, we have many of the 21 authors to talk about the flourishing present, the flourishing future, and all things need to know. We are glad you are here.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of The Right Side Up. And this season is Need to Know, because there's some stuff you do need to know. There's some stuff a lot of people need to know. And we have some special guests with us, some authors that are part of the compilation that we have put together. Which, by the way, what we're hoping is to get that in the hands of every male leader you know, because we think they need to know some things. So Julie, this will be, you have been on the summer season. So this is the second time we've heard from you, and we had a beautiful time talking about Eve Isn't Evil, your book on the Old Testament. In this book, you wrote specifically in the abuse, anti-abuse and advocacy part. Can you tell me a little bit about the chapter that you wrote and why you wrote it?
Sure. Thanks so much, first of all, Danielle. It's so wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this book that I think is so important, and I really hope has a wide impact because its words are so needed in the world and specifically in the church. So my chapter is on the abuse of girls and women in the Bible. And I wrote this because this is a huge problem in our country and in the world, and we don't pay any attention to it or hardly any attention to it in the church. And that's really a problem. We maintain this illusion, this dangerous delusion that everyone's fine. But statistics show that is not the case at all, that 1 in 3 women have experienced some sort of abuse, 1 in 7 men have experienced some sort of abuse. And yet we go along as if this is a problem that belongs somewhere else. But not only is it in the pews, in the folks in our congregations, but it's also in the Bible. And a lot of people don't realize that because we read often very selectively in the Bible and specifically in the church. We just choose the passages that we know, that we feel familiar with, that we're comfortable with, that we find uplifting. And there's some really difficult stories in there. And so I wanted to bring those to light and talk about how they can be helpful to us in our ministries.
You know, Julie, it's so powerful because the more you look into how prevalent a story of women, and particularly women who are on the underside of power or on the receiving end of patriarchy, you start to understand that these stories are written on purpose. Like, God's put these stories in the canon forever. You know, and I remember talking when I stood out against an abusive pastor publicly, and everybody was like, stop that, you're going to hurt the church. Stop that, you're going to hurt the church. Stop that, you're going to hurt the church. You know, this kind of idea that, like, if we don't see and we don't talk about it and we silence women, somehow this will protect the church. I remember a biblical theologian friend of mine said to me, Danielle, if God cared about the reputation of the church, he wouldn't have written the Bible the way that he writes the Bible. Like, the Bible is written in such a way that abusers are exposed. The conversation is had. The women's story is told. And the fact that, like, in a fiercely patriarchal, setting, like probably way more patriarchal than our setting that we're in a Western framework anyway, these stories are preserved and put back into the text, and then we just ignore them.
Right.
I mean, because that's a shocking thing that they're even there. Like, the fact that women are named and their stories are told, and like these very, very problematic stories are told that leave you troubled and like, what on earth? The fact that's in the Bible is like its own shock.
It is. And I think another huge issue is, how do we read them? First, Danielle, I want to comment. You say, don't hurt their church, don't hurt the church. Like, women are the church, and in your introduction that you read to Helen, he talked about how, I love this line where he said, if women just went on strike from churches, they'd come to a grinding halt. It is so true. So, I mean, that language, let's protect the church, that's really a veil, or let's protect the powerful men who are abusing people. and let's
Yep.
continue with things the way they are, because, that's certainly not the church as Jesus, that I see coming out of the initial Jesus community, which I
Yeah.
think is really, really important. But these stories, as you say, they are there. And a lot is how we read them. Some
Yeah.
of them are so horrific. One of the stories I write about is the story of the Levite's concubine, which is in Judges chapters 19 through 21. And as you may know, but I think a lot of people are not familiar with this story. You may know the story, but a lot of people, I think, are not familiar with it, because it's the story of this woman who leaves her husband and she goes to her father, who is in Bethlehem, interestingly. And her husband, who's not named, he's just called the Levite, goes after her to speak tenderly to her, the text says. And then he gets there. He says nothing to her. He has a wonderful time bonding with the father-in-law. They spend 3 days together eating and drinking. Then he says, it's time to go. They go and they end up stopping in this town. They're going to stop at one town. They say, no, this isn't safe enough. They go to this other town, Gibeah, and there the men come and they get taken in by this old man, and the men come to rape the Levite. It's sort of reminiscent. So this is in Judges 19. It's kind of reminiscent of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is in Genesis 19. And the men come to rape the Levite. And the man, it doesn't say whether it's the owner of the home or the Levite, the man throws her out and says, here, and my virgin daughter, go ahead, rape them, have a good time, have at it. And they do. They rape, the daughter disappears from the story, but the Levite's concubine is gang raped all night. And then in the morning, she holds onto the threshold of the door. And the only words he says to her, he went to speak tenderly to her. The only words he says to her in the entire story are, get up. She gets up, or he picks her up. We don't even know if she's dead. In the Hebrew, it doesn't say whether or not she's dead. In the Greek, it says she is dead. Ho nekriote. She, because dead she's not speaking. But in the Hebrew, we don't get that. And she's put on this donkey. And I think for Christians, we may hear echoes of like the Good Samaritan, this battered person put on the donkey like, oh, this is to save her. But no, he brings her home and cuts her body into 12 pieces that he sends to the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, it is horrific on every single level. What is a story like that doing in the text? Well, at the very end of the book of Judges, chapter 21, it says in English, consider, take counsel, and speak. Like, this is a story for us to speak out about. But do we? Do we point to what has happened here? How horrible this is? I mean, it's hard to imagine much worse than gang rape. And yet it's in sacred scripture to point out this heinous reality and to help us to recognize how the text says, speak out about it. And yet we don't.
Yeah. And that itself is its own, the fact that we don't, even though it's clear in the text, and it's disruptive on purpose. I mean, it's not just written like in an invisible way in like a back chapter somewhere. It's literally part of the story. And even that, like cutting her in 12 pieces and sending her to the tribes is like this, like alarm. It's alarming, man.
Right. That's right.
It's alarming. Like, and this is the people of God. And I think this is not like a judgment on, those pagans who treat their women badly. This is right here, right now. This is the people of God. From the very beginning, this is the people of God. Anita, your chapter really is around this erasure of women in history and church history, and how, this erasing of women is its own problem, and we lose so much as a result, the whole church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Tell us more.
Yeah, and I largely, became fascinated with that topic because I was, a young woman in ministry and going through seminary, and finding out from one of my professors that women have been as active in like interpreting scripture, theology, all of the things that men have been doing just as long as men have been. And I remember sitting in a seminary class in my second year seminary, by the way, and I was like 30-year-old pastor at this point, which is just mind boggling to me. And I just had this like heart stop moment of, what if that's true? What if that is true? And it obviously is and was. And so I just began chasing and like looking for my mothers and grandmothers of the faith and saying, like, if this is true and discipleship is something that was important to me at that time in my life and is important to me now. So I was just looking at what examples do we have of discipleship playing out in the Bible and in the early church that we can learn from now. And there's just so much that when I began looking at the Gospels with that lens, there was so many women that we could use examples of. And so that was like life altering for me. So I was delighted to be able to write more about that.
Anita, sorry, can I just jump in on Anita's chapter, which I loved, because one thing I found so fascinating, and it was kind of stunning to me. I hadn't thought of it before, but it was really a light bulb moment for me when you talked about the early church taking place in the domestic sphere. And that was the sphere of women. And so, obviously, I mean, I knew about the women in the book of Acts and Romans and the roles that they take as leaders. But to make that connection, like, of course, this is taking place with women as leaders because this is their domain. That was really insightful to me. So thank you for that, Anita.
Thank you. I attribute it to my research.
What's really cool too is that, like, I think that's the future church, and actually everywhere. And this also helps explain, and again, this is like God's kingdom specialty, isn't it? To like kind of judo the devaluing of people as social classes and the way that societies are set up, and kind of like use a judo move on it, is be like, no, this is the very place that we're going to actually overthrow power, right? Mary sort of tells us that right from the get-go. She gets it right away. But I feel like that the future church is that way too. Like what a male ordering and centering or patriarchy has done is sort of centered power, and then hierarchy and high levels of control and sort of upward things instead of outward and down, right? Which is where, that those home-based movements just exploded in the early church. First 400 years of the first Christians is the fastest growth in the world, right? Like, it was just insane amount of growth. But also in the world right now, like they say Iran, the underground church in Iran is like moving really, really fast. And they're like, why? And they're like, because women are holding house gatherings. Like, it's just like, oh, no way.
It's amazing.
And
That's
it's like,
amazing.
I'm at a church planters conference and they're like, there's this cool strategy. And I'm like, guys.
Right? And it's brand new. We've never seen this before. It's like,
I'm like, two home women. It's always been the strategy. Oh my gosh.
I think that is so fascinating to me, because I feel like for now in the church, we are really on the verge of something. And I love the idea of it going out, down and out, as you say, Danielle, but out and down, like not down and out, because we think of that as sort of like bad on your luck, but, out and down. Because really what's happening now in the church, so I identify as a progressive Christian. I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church and very involved in my United Methodist Church here in Manhattan, where I live. And also my husband's pastor of Presbyterian Church, where I also worship. But it is. It's fun. But it's really interesting because the progressive churches are just like dying on the vine. I mean, you pass by 5 church buildings and 4 of them are pretty much empty on Sundays if they haven't already been closed. And it makes me sad in some ways. But in other ways, I feel like this is the cycle of the church and we need to see what's going to happen next. Phyllis Tickle, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she talks about every 500 years, the church reinventing itself. Are you familiar with this?
Yep. Yeah. Keep going, though. I love it.
Okay. So, in the year 0, you have Jesus. That's really big for the church, right?
Yeah.
And then around 500, the monks saved Christianity by bringing it with them into the monasteries. They saved the text. They saved this, they saved the stories. They saved the tradition. 1000, you get the split of the Eastern and Western Church, Orthodoxy from Catholicism. 1500, Martin Luther breaks off and says, no, the Reformation, we're going to do something new. We are right on time for the next big thing. Reformation was 1517. It's like almost, it's like right there, almost to the year. And I think it's not a coincidence that Martin Luther's Reformation came with 2 generations after the invention of the printing press, not even, and now, like I went to college with a typewriter. Those days are gone. They are never coming back. I do not write a script on the board. My students can't read it. People have been reading script for centuries. And it's just like, what is the church going to be? It's huge. But I think the calling of the church is to do what the church does so well, which is to build these loving relationships, like to have conversations where people talk to each other and don't have phones in their hands. There are very few places where that exists now, but church is one of them. And that we can have these real conversations where people are sitting down face to face, caring about each other, sharing stories of Jesus. I just love that image.
Actually, what's really funny is the final act of Paul. It's one of my favorite ones where like he's done everything conceivable to try to like reach people with this message of good news. And then his final act as like the most seasoned apostle in the world is to rent a house and welcome everyone who will come. That's the final
Wonderful.
That's the final words of the greatest apostle of all time. And I think, oh, look at that. He's practicing hospitality like a woman.
Right.
That's what he's
really
doing.
wonderful.
He's finally going, oh, maybe there's something about, welcome. Maybe there's something about hospitality. Maybe there's something about like, relationship. Maybe there's some, and it's really a fascinating, he goes from this conquest to this radical welcome as I think one of the greatest strategies of the church, and like a secret that we keep not discovering because it's, I don't know because we don't want to talk about women. So, so this talking about women, I was just reading Dr. Gaffney's retelling of some of the Old Testament stories, the Old Testament women. And one of her quotes that I thought was really great, and Julie kind of fits right into what you're offering, and I think Anita to you too. And it's this idea that these texts, because we keep saying, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then we don't say God is the God of Sarah and Hagar and Zipporah. And, like we don't say any of those things. And the reason we don't say any of those things is because they're way more problematic. Like as soon as, if you just say God is the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac and Jacob, then you can just carry on as though it's about God's faithfulness. It's about whatever. But as soon as you start listing all of the women that they either married or used or abused or, like were caught up in these systems, then there's another conversation to be had. Then there's the complex telling. And she's like, the troubling nature of those relationships is where all the learning is. It's where all the change of behavior, it's where all the confrontation is in the text. It's where all like those real, like come to Jesus conversations were missing. So it's not even just like we're erasing women, we're erasing the opportunity to talk with God about what kind of people we're going to be and what kind of God we follow. And I think maybe in some ways I think that just kind of nails the problem in a way, is that this is not just about like the erasing of women. This is the erasing of what God wants to say. Like we're missing our come to Jesus moment. And you just, you said even with abuse, like when I was part of a church that had this big abuse scandal, the church had said they wanted to reach a generation, they wanted to reach an unchristian world. And I said to them, 1 in 3 women are sexually abused. So this would be your best opportunity to talk about this, to deal with this properly, to confront a predator, to stand with a victim. This would be the best strategy you have to actually reach 1 in 3, of your world, and yet they could not, would not, cannot. And I guess it's just a practice. I guess part of it is just a practice thing. I don't know.
It's also so messy. It takes a real commitment, because you're going to invite people to share the rawest, most difficult part of who they are. And that's really hard. And that's and that can really upset your structures. I think it's a whole game changer. And I mean, you talk about this in your introduction, Danielle, which I think is really terrific. The whole stakeholder principle. It's not in people's interest to make things difficult for themselves. And so why bother? I mean, you give a really good reason. We could really reach out to people who would be very grateful for this kind of ministry. And yet it's too upsetting to the ministry that the ministry is to me. So why should I undertake that?
Yeah.
Danielle, you said this is like we had like a come to Jesus moment a few minutes ago, but I'm thinking of like the genealogy of Matthew. Like this is the way Jesus came to us. Like Tamar and Rahab are both listed in the genealogy of Matthew.
Yeah, I think that
I'm going to get emotional.
That's yeah. That's an incredible, that's really important. Like, this isn't just us coming to Jesus. This is how Jesus comes
It's
to
how
us.
Jesus came to us.
Yeah. Right. And again, even because we don't tell the story enough, we don't tell how radical it was for a Jewish man to put women who were outsiders and what everyone else would like suppress in their family history, like to like
Yeah.
write their names in a text that would be recorded forever. Like, we just don't talk about how radical that is.
Right. And both
And how
arguably sexually abused.
and how, right. Oh, 100%. Who are, yeah. Like, I mean, Tamar is like itself, just like, it's great. Like, what do we do with that? What do we do with
She
Tamar? I
talks
mean,
about it.
there
Yeah.
she is.
And
Yeah.
that's also incest. You know, that's another whole level.
Yes.
When's the last time you heard anyone talk about that in the church? I mean,
Right.
this is real. And it's a sad, that story of Tamar is a sad story because she becomes a desolate woman. 2 Samuel 13. She's a desolate woman by the end of it. I mean, her life has been shattered.
Yeah.
And for a lot of women, that's true. And yet, what do we do? What do we say? How do we seek to help? But I think you're so right, both of you, in terms of these finding the stories of these women and the messiness of them. And when we look at the stories, for example, of Genesis, the very beginning where the whole Bible starts, which is really foundational not only to the Hebrew Bible, but I think to the entire Bible, to the entire canon. Those women are some of them. People have no idea who they are. We need to say their names. We need to share their stories. So we have, of course, Sarah, who's the first wife, and comes with Abraham from Mesopotamia, from Ur of the Chaldeans, in end of Genesis chapter 11. And the only thing we're told about her is that she's barren. That's it. But that's something that can really relate to people too. So every family isn't perfect. A lot of families struggle with fertility issues, and then then they take a surrogate. People think, oh, that's such a modern thing. It goes back thousands and thousands of years. There are lots of surrogate contracts from Mesopotamia. This has been going on for a long time, and they create a family this way. And then Hagar dies, and no one has heard of Abraham's third wife, Keturah, Genesis chapter 95,
Right.
and so here she is, the woman that he marries in his old age, and she gives him 6 sons. That's really significant in the Bible. Then you go to Isaac and Rebekah. Rebekah is the power player. The same promise that's given to Abraham in Genesis 22 is given to Rebekah in Genesis 24. Your ancestor will possess the gates of you'll be the ancestor of myriads, and your offspring shall possess the gates of their foes. Same words. She gets that promise, goes to Rebekah. So I think it goes Abraham, Rebekah, Jacob, not Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Just saying.
Nice. Yeah, because actually, because in that text she has all the agency. She takes all the agency,
That's right.
and she makes
That's
everything
right.
happen. So it's a
Exactly.
very interesting, that is not normal. Like even the way that the text tells the story is just like, what?
I think it happens a lot more than we realize in real life. I mean, a lot of couples, a woman is the power player. It's just the text is being honest about it there. And then Isaac prefers Esau, and she prefers Jacob. Who rises? Jacob, the one the mother favors, and then Jacob has his 4 wives, Leah, who has lots of children. Rachel has a hard time, the beloved wife. And then also don't leave out the maids, Zilpah and Bilhah. Sometimes you'll hear Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, but Bilhah and Zilpah are also important because now we're bringing issues of class. They never speak in the entire text, but each of them bears 2 sons. So this story is so much fuller and so much richer when we bring in the women, and also so much more relatable. And when people talk about biblical family values, I'm like, look at this family, because it's a mess, just like our families.
Yeah, I always say that with biblical marriage. I'm like, which one? Which version of biblical marriage are you defending?
Truly.
Oh, wow.
Truly.
Yeah, the one thing so just even telling the stories, like, so there, and I guess that's part of, besides just like things are wrong, the way that we skip those still and refuse to actually wrestle with and look at the text and bring up the issues that the text raises. And that's part of that I think a generation of Christians that look at the Bible as this like, rule book or this like principle book. If you just follow these principles, then ta-da, you'll be okay. Instead of the Bible as a disruption, as an invitation to think differently and think deeper and get honest and wrestle with the text and like figure out what this means and what this brings up for you. So I think the Bible as a catalyst for, those getting deeper. So we miss that. And we miss that because we tell these stories in a way that is just like, where we're whitewashing over what's actually happening for real. And I think the same with church history. I think the same is true with church history, and I do believe, like you said, in those every 500 years, there's a reinvention, and that there is the only reason we're even talking about this, I think, as much as we are, is because of the internet. Like, I just literally, I think like the Me Too movement should have happened way sooner, right? Like, I mean, literally, like, what is 11 million people, hashtag Me Too to tell their own, like, I've been abused, I've been harassed, I know what this is like. 11 million women who would not have been able to say so anywhere else, who have been silenced and shut out. So, like, in so many ways, our culture's mirroring sort of this system of power that has been silencing and marginalizing women's voices and women's stories and, all these things. So I think it's powerful for that alone. Just like have another look. Like, so if you're listening to this podcast, like just go back and have a look. I mean, read this book. That's a good start. Pick up Julie Faith Barker's book, Eve is an Evil. That's another great, just that looking at some, like, how do we get, there it is. How do we get so, caught in these like marginalizing and stereotyping of women instead of actually looking for the actual story. Okay, we've kicked off a season called Need to Know, and the reason we've done that is it is in conjunction with Need to Know the book. Now, there is a website you're going to need to know, which is need-to-know-book.com. A lot of dashes, need-to-know-book.com. The link will be in the show notes. And this is where all the things will be. Get this book into the hands of every leader that you know, because this is need to know for every Christian leader about the future of the church and how the empowerment of women are a big part of that. So go there, read this stuff, write the reviews, and spread the word and help us get this out. There's really no use. And actually, I'm a little bit tired of talking about this stuff, but it not being heard by the people that need to hear it the most. So we need help. So if you'd like to join our launch team, you can go to the website and just press launch team and join us. There's lots of perks in there, but also a great company of people who want to spread good news everywhere. The other key area that you could help us, and I'm very excited about this, is there's an ally section. Allies. Now, men come to me all the time these days and say, I am all for this. I think it's essential conversation. I think it's an essential practice, but I don't know what to do. Well, here you go, guys. Here's something that you could actually do. Be an ally. And there's an ally section. What the allies will do is use the book as a resource. So start book studies locally or on your web platforms. Highlight in whatever way you have, either in your pulpit or in your Bible study or your home group or on your podcast, a couple of authors in the book, a couple contributors, which there are 21. So there's a plethora of experts on various topics. And then just genuinely stand in solidarity that this is something that needs to change for the future of the church. So if that's you, please ally. Now, you don't have to be a guy to be an ally, but boy, that would be good. So we have a good start, but I would love there to be 500 allies. I mean, why not? And it is time, actually. Women can't just from the outside keep, shouting. I mean, we will, but we can't keep shouting. We actually need allies who will help us get this message out and embed it, get it in to the cultures and to the system. So anyway, this is what we're calling you to, but launch team, please help us, and allies. We need you. Need-to-know-book.com. Now's the time. But Anita, the other thing I was thinking is something you said, which is that you were on a search for grandmas and mothers. Like there's something that's raw. And when you said that, I remembered this. I was at this conference and these women from the Baptist tradition kind of got up and basically were like, guys, like, we're the first generation. They were starting to lead within their context, and they were like, we're the first generation. So like, we don't know how to do this. And I just was like at the back going, no, you're not. Like, not even in the Baptist tradition. I'm like, no, you are not. I'm at the back going, this is a travesty that you think this. There are so many women that have gone before you, and you just don't know who they are, because that's how this works. And erasing your own tradition and women that stood up in hard places and spoke anyway and did the thing anyway. Like, you need to know who they are. So your work is not to say, oh, we're the first ones. Your work is to go find your mothers and your grandmothers in the faith, because they exist.
Yeah. I think that will be, I mean, that's my work, but I also think that's going to be a big part of our work of this generation of the church, is finding the stories of our mothers and grandmothers, because what I learned, like throughout learning a lot of the history, and much from a professor I studied under at Wycliffe College, Mary Taylor, who's done a lot of work in this area, is that these women were generation after generation, because they didn't have a record of the previous generation, were repeatedly reinventing the wheel, like, feeling the call, or like, God speaking to them and saying, I want you to speak, I want you to teach, I want you to lead, I want you to, travel and preach, I want you to do these things that you see other people who are following Jesus well doing. And that's what I have for you to do. And then they have to also struggle against everything in their world, like the culture, people trying to put them back in their place. And then like sometimes succumbing to that, and sometimes we don't, so many we wouldn't even ever hear of, but sometimes rising above that and saying, no, by what authority do I remain silent? I remember that of one of the things that Marian had said, one of the women had said, I can't remember which one, but by what authority do I remain silent? And I think that's just it. By what authority would we remain silent, but also by what authority do we allow the erasure of women and the history of women? I think Julie can probably speak to this, but even the compilation of our history of interpretation from Eve all the way through 2,000 years is where we're sitting today, in terms of how we understand women interacting with ministry, right? So if we are able to just retrieve a fraction of the stories that exist, and then have that included as part of our legacy of discipleship, but also our history, So when you flip through the back of the index in the history textbooks, you see some women's names there. The trajectory of that for the next 100, 200,000 years could be incredible. And it could look a lot more like the early church.
Sometimes I find this encouraging, because, like for you, Anita, how you discovered these women and you realized what was there. And for you, Danielle, realizing that these women had these foremothers they didn't know. But in some ways, I find it really discouraging. It's like, it's like, why? Because I feel like in some ways we do keep reinventing this wheel. I mean, I was in seminary decades ago in the late 80s. And I thought, oh, thank goodness, by the time I get out and serving a congregation, I'm ordained in I'm at this church. I worked as a pastor for 10 years. By the time I get out serving a congregation, this will all be taken care of. Inclusive language will be a done deal. It'll be something. And now, as a professor of Old Testament, I was assigned my students to read Phyllis Tribble, whom I read as an undergraduate, who wrote this book called God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality that really introduced feminist interpretation of the Old Testament. And my students are like, oh my goodness, it's so radical. And I think, good Lord, this was published in 1978, and here we are still finding this really radical to say, hey, Eve actually is very smart and is an ethical decision maker. Oh no, she's just that sexy woman who likes apples, and brings down humanity. Like still, it's a lot of work. And I get discouraged by how much effort, and we read about this in the book, how much effort goes into keeping good women down. And both of your stories back that up. And mine too, to some extent, like, even in the progressive church, I remember being at a faculty meeting, being called a slut by a colleague. I mean, it's outrageous what people still get away with. Right. And here we are.
I was thinking about this, that like starting again, that, and that, is thinking about that, the way that it's like an amnesia, but also it's like there's a fight just to remember. I think this is true of all oppression, by the way. Like I remember when I was in a Black community in America, and I went to see the first Black Panther movie in this, like, and it was like literally my husband and I were like the only white people in the theater. And I don't know, like I was part of something happening in that theater that would not have understood or even touched if I had have just seen that in, like, a suburban white community, because something happened in this idea that your starting place is not your oppression. Your starting place is glorious. Your starting place is strong. Your starting place is smart. And I was thinking about, like, and that moment in that theater, which is so true for, Black Americans, particularly, who were so, they were erased. Their histories were erased. And you see this, like, one of the ways that they kind of rise to who they are is to try to touch who they were before the oppression, And I think there's so much of that we're talking about here. This is a similar thing. We're trying to find these. But again, if you don't want people to rise, right? If you're threatened by the rising, if you're, saying like, hey, you should, then there's this backlash against the rise. And I feel like, in the statistics, so women's rights in America, particularly, like they peaked in the 80s, like in 79, 80, they were at a peak and they've been falling ever since. And I wrote a book called Better Together because I was like, what happened? Because even like, so I would say, Julie, not only are we not further along, we're behind where you were when this was happening for you, where that was like, wow, and people's lights were going on and there was like all these things happening. We're behind. And so anyway, there's all kinds of social reasons for this, but basically there is like a designed, I think, because in the scriptures, it says the enemy knows that the seed of the woman is the end of the enemy. So I feel like there actually is a good reason why the perpetuation of evil is so female based, right? Like it's just to keep women down. Because I actually think that the devil knows what the church should know, which is that if you would let women rise, if you would help and support and like actually help women further their callings and do what God's gifted them to do in a way that God's gifted them to do it, you would see the end of evil and the furtherance of the kingdom. So there is this kind of like, I think it's like, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you not want women, like in real life, in your own relationships? Like, we have children, they love us. I love them. We have sisters, they love us. We love them. Like you. And so you're just like, why is this perpetuated, this thing against women? Like, what is the win? Who wins? And you see broken, even in the text, I feel like the answer in these texts, when we bring up these problematic stories, is everyone loses. Right. Everyone loses when you treat women badly. Everybody loses. The families are broken. The trajectory is bad. Like this is, King David. Everyone's like, I want to be King David. I'm like, do you? He like split the kingdom. He like ruined his family. Like he's like one of the worst examples of leadership I've ever seen. Right. I think he can sing well and he was a bit honest. So like, cheers. But I'm like, wow, like what is this power? It's almost a power that continues to press us down. And I guess
that's repentance. There's a way that people could be like King David. They would want to be like King David.
Yeah, at least an acknowledgement. At least an acknowledgement. He didn't kill Nathan. There's something, like, yes, he didn't kill Nathan and he acknowledged, I don't know, repentance in terms of like changing behavior.
Okay, true.
Yeah.
I think, sorry. I just want to make a comment to piggyback on what you said, Danielle, because when I was doing my research, I noticed it was like a nerdy thing. I just started to look at when all these books were published. I kind of like started putting them in piles. And a lot of the books and resources that I was using were late 70s, early 80s. And then there was like a sprinkle in the 90s. And I was like, what the heck happened here? Like, where is everyone? What's going on? And I think that does tie into just what we're looking for, but like both the silencing and the erasure, but also the powers that be, in whatever form they come, just looking to silence and I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think what I want to say is like, if we can be telling these stories, then the power, even what you're talking about in the movie theater, it's like redeeming and bringing these compelling stories forward. I don't think I would have ever had the audacity to begin this research if I didn't have stories or examples like you, Danielle. I remember seeing you speaking in like 2015 or something like that, and seeing you walk on stage and having the stories that you shared, but also seeing you walk on stage without any like apology or in your body language or in your tone of voice or anything like that. And I didn't even know you at that point. And I was like, God, is that what's possible for other women? Wow. Like being able to ask ourselves, I think what Jesus leads us to as we rediscover the stories that are kind of like, it feels to me like they're like stolen from us, as we rediscover those and as we bring those forward, Jesus helps us ask good questions about, which is good theology, I suppose, but ask good questions about how we are, as the church, are interacting with the world right now, right? And as we see what shambles of the church that we see when we look around, especially on social media and things like that today, how could we ask good questions about that and how we got there in order to both dismantle, but also can we just not? I think one of the things that I really wanted to say is I think the thing that we mess up is that these marginalized or the more oppressed groups, so like women, minorities, LGBT, all of these groups are often spend like the first couple of decades. So anyone in the category of voices that the church hasn't traditionally listened to, they spend the first couple of decades like defending their existence and their calling. And what I would love to see us do, or, is stop that. Like when I was rearranging my bookshelf, when I had time to do that like 2 years ago, I took all of the marginalized voices and I put them in a pile and I put them at the center. And the thing that I noticed, because I did that, is that they were all defending their existence. They were all saying, hey, we're here and it's okay that we're here. And God called us to, and this is how we can kind of interact with that. And then I had all of these other sections, like 12 other sections that were just like waxing poetical about atonement theory and things like that. And it's like, can we just get past the part where we have to defend ourselves and give ourselves a platform or excuse, imposter syndrome, whatever it is, to get us there, and just do the work of discipleship, just do the work of what God has put before us. So I think that's what I'm like so excited about being part of this generation, that we have a history of our mothers. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. This will be the first generation of women and people who have a history of our mothers as well. And so let's not lose that. Like, how important is that to the future of the church and how we like reimagine what the church can be now? Yeah. I use the word reimagine deliberately intentional.
Good. Yeah, we're working on a movement, Julie, of female church planters reimagining the church for the future. It's called Reimagine by Women Co.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. What do you, so tell me a little more, please.
Yeah, well, kind of around this idea that it's time, it's time for a reimagining of what the church is in a Western context, and that women are the most equipped to do this because they are outside most of the power structures and they have already learned how to work outside of central power because they've been forced to. So I remember this aha moment where I was like lamenting, like, why aren't they on the leadership? Like, why aren't they, like all these things? And I was like, wait a minute. They are the ones that have the least to lose. They're the ones that have the most practice in this, flexible way of doing the kingdom outside of the like programmed attractional model of church. And I think this might be the time where those practiced skills, whether or not they were intended, this is one of those judo moments where God's like, got it. We're going to flip it now. It's kind of that. And it's not like a flip in that God wants power to be centralized. It's not, we know that's not how God is and not what God wants, but it is a judo flip in terms of these people that you left out are the ones that I'm actually going to use powerfully for good. And so I think we are in sort of that moment. So we just want to try to help. So Reimagine by Women Co. do you know the website, Anita? I'm terrible at promoting my own websites. Anyway, Reimagine by Women Co. It's a movement that's just beginning. We're co-creating it together. So you can go to the website, you can sign up, there's a Mighty Network thing where you can join a group and just begin to start exploring what is it that we could reimagine together. It's kind of exciting. It's very new. It's not like all set because we really want to co-create this thing in real time, so anyway,
It's
that's a little
I think
pitch
womenco.org.
for
that's
that.
great. I
Yeah.
love it. I
Yeah.
love the image. I love the vision because it sounds so biblical, honestly.
Yeah.
It sounds like what Jesus did. Let's bring people in. Let's bring in the people who are on the margins. Let's listen to them. Let's create a community together. Jesus was, I don't even know how anybody could begin to justify hierarchy looking at Jesus. And Anita, you mentioned in your chapter how Jesus chose these 12 male disciples, and that's often used to vault male leadership. But I've always wanted to say, not so fast, because there are women. The word for disciple in Greek is mathetes in the masculine form, which simply means learner, like mathematics. But mathetes in the feminine form, because there's Tabitha, as you probably know, in Acts 9 is called a disciple. And it's not like it's any big deal, like, oh, and there was this woman who also was qualified, so we're going to call her a disciple. No, just matter of factly, here's Tabitha, who's a disciple, is devoted to acts of good work and mercy. And also there are a lot of women who are much, like Mary Magdalene, for example, who's much closer to Jesus, much more integral to his ministry. She's there in every single gospel, first person to witness the risen Christ. And John, as you know, she's the only one there to witness this risen Christ. And to have this encounter with him in the garden. And yet we don't call her a disciple. Like, what can you tell me about Thaddeus? What can you tell me about Bartholomew?
Right.
I'll tell you nothing, because it's not in the Gospels, and they're not even stable. The list of the 12 varies in the different Gospels. Is it Bartholomew? Is it Nathaniel comes in and John? I mean, it varies, because the reason why you have the 12 is because of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah.
You need to get 12 to correspond to 12,
Right.
But there were women who were disciples of Jesus. I'm as certain as one can be this side of heaven.
Julie, are you up on the Mary the Tower stuff?
I am. Yes, I am.
Tell us quickly about this, because I think this is like mind blowing. And then maybe we'll put in the show notes like where people can go to hear more. But there is some latest research around, speaking of erasure in church history, of the erasing really of Mary's primary role as apostolic in the early church.
Yes. So this is largely the scholarship of Elizabeth Schrader Polzer. She's a New Testament scholar who teaches at Villanova. And I interviewed her actually for Eve is an Evil, and got to know her a little bit through that process. But she's also done her work has been the basis of a famous that's been downloaded over 250,000 times that Diana Butler Bass preached. So that's another place to find her work, and as well as, through academic resources. But anyway, she wrote about how Mary Magdalene, she suggests that on the basis of textual variance. So basically, if you write Maria or Martha in Greek, it's just the changing of an iota to a theta, which is a very simple change. And she suggests that Mary's name was changed to Martha in John 11, and that Mary Magdalene is the sister of Lazarus, and that because in that story of the raising of Lazarus, it's Martha who gives the Christological confession and says, "I know you are the Christ." But she says actually it could have been Mary Magdalene, and it was too controversial because she was already so prominent, and so other scribes basically made Mary into a Martha. So this paper is published in the Harvard Theological Review. It's very solid academically on the basis of these early manuscripts that she has uncovered.
Well, and it's sent a lot of textual scholars and stuff spinning and researching, and so it's legit enough that everyone's freaking out.
It's true. And
Right.
and also that name Mary Magdalene. So she co-wrote an article with Joan Taylor, who's an Aramaic scholar in England. And which was published in the Journal of Biblical Literature, a preeminent biblical journal. And they say in that Magdala. So if you go to Israel, Palestine today, you can visit the town of Magdala where they'll tell you where she was from. But that site, there's no place called Magdala that existed in the first century at Jesus's time. And that's actually much later. And so gadol in Hebrew means to make big or great. And in Greek, it doesn't say Mary Magdalene. It says Maria Magdalene, Mary the Magdalene. And so you could translate that as Mary the Tower. Migdal is tower in Hebrew Aramaic, or Mary the Magnified One. If we were reading about Mary the Magnified One all the time, because Jesus gave his friends nicknames, Peter the Rock, Thomas the Twin, James
Mary
and
the
John,
Tower.
were they sons of thunder? That's right, Mary the Tower. So she is the towering presence among the early disciples of Jesus.
And that was the idea, like Peter the Rock and Mary the Tower. So like I think some of the concepts around the research is like she was that kind of prominent apostolic witness. So you say, Peter, you're the rock, and on you I'm going to build the kingdom. Mary, you're the tower, and you are going to announce the good news. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just like it's that kind of like bookend that has been erased. And that's, I mean, wow. And that's new, that the idea that like she just accidentally found like this mistake in a scroll is sort of, I think, how it started, and was like, that can't be right. Like, and then just was like, that can't be real. And then everyone was like, no, that can't be real. And then they were like, oh my God. Like, so it's one of these, like, and I think it's this awakening. And in some ways, I think even that research is about the awakening of, this is not just something we're feeling. This is not something we're defending. This is God's great design for the church. Like, this is God going, guys, pay attention. Women, wake up. Like, you have, not only do you have mothers, not only do you have grand, you have towers.
And
you have towers.
Sorry, Danielle, just when you're mentioning this about her discovering these manuscripts. So Elizabeth Schrader Pulitzer, she was a singer-songwriter in Brooklyn, and she wrote this song about Mary Magdalene, and she just felt like she was urged, like this movement of the Spirit to get her to do this. And she had no intention of getting a master's degree. She had no intention of learning Greek. But she told me that she's also a very devout Episcopalian, that she would pray, she would go to chapel, and then she would be led to this manuscript where she would find more of these insights,
Wow.
And that was the work of the Spirit that she would be led to find these textual variants. Like, she really felt Mary Magdalene was kind of, yes, that's right.
There's a reason that she felt led to that it's time to discover that. Like, I think you're right. It's a season. So guys, we're hoping that this inspires you. Know Your Mothers. There's a great Instagram handle by that, Know Your Mothers, that introduces women from the scripture in really cool art and story form on Instagram. If you don't know that, you should. Eve Isn't Evil, wonderful book. Anita wrote the chapter in this Need to Know. Get that book and start reading it. But even just start engaging with the scriptures in a way that might lead you deeper and then free you to actually agree with Jesus about Jesus's strategy from the very beginning. This will be very liberating for a lot of people, including men. And the key to the future of the church, I believe fully in this season, especially, that there is a reinvention. It is reinvention, reimagine time, and women are key to this unlocking. So if you're a male leader, if you're not, buy a case, give it to them, whatever we need to do to get the word out. And for the record, this is not bad news. It's good news. Like, this is the good news of the gospel that is liberating for everyone. And women are at the center of that story. So thank you, Julie. Thank you, Anita, for what you've written, but also what you've lived. Thank you for being mothers and grandmothers and witnesses. Like, thank you for being faithful. Thanks for saying yes to God and showing us what it's like to be obedient. And we're excited. We're excited.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Thank you for your vision. Thank you for your courage. I love this idea of re-inspiring and recreating the church. And it's really exciting. And it's wonderful to know that you are creative and faithful and adventurous enough to do it. I admire you for it. And it's so nice to meet with you, Anita, and to have the chance to talk with you both. Thank you so much.
Amen.